They thought the game ended long before you realized it began. They thought they had the rules in their pocket, that you were a pawn without awareness. What they never counted on was that your instinct, your quiet resolve, and your refusal to fold were all shaping you to play a deeper game. You weren't chasing trophies or applause. You weren't even aware there was a scoreboard. Yet every time you endured, every time you rose after falling, every time you chose patience over impulse, you were stacking points in a game you didn't know existed. And when the curtain dropped, when the truth was revealed, you had already aced it without even trying to impress anyone. You didn't need to prepare for this final game, because life itself had been preparing you all along. They were distracted chasing smaller wins. They fought battles that looked glorious but left them drained. You learned that losing temporary fights often meant winning something greater later. You let them mock your silence, your restraint, your lack of reaction. But in truth, every quiet moment you owned was training. Every refusal to sink to their level was strategy. By the time the final game arrived, you were already conditioned to withstand pressure they could not handle. You walked into it unknowingly, yet carried everything you needed. They mistook your lack of urgency for weakness. They assumed you didn't care enough to compete, as if obsession with appearances was the only sign of strength. But you weren't seeking validation. You weren't trying to dominate every space you entered. You were building an inner world, an inner balance, that couldn't be shaken. The final game was not about who looked strongest, but who could endure the longest. When the spotlight turned, they panicked. You simply kept moving as you always had, steady, deliberate, unshaken. They believed the rules of the game were theirs to decide. They thought manipulation, shortcuts, and shallow victories were the way forward. But hidden games do not reward illusions. They reward reality. You were never performing. You were never pretending. You chose to be grounded when they chose to be theatrical. You chose to carry weight when they chose to drop it. That is why when the last round came, their tricks collapsed under pressure, and your truth stood tall. The game exposed what was real and reality favored you. What unsettled them most was that you were not even trying to win. You were simply being yourself, refined through every test, sharpened by every setback, hardened by silence and solitude. They couldn't grasp how someone who didn't chase control ended up holding it. But that is the nature of the final game. It punishes those who seek power without substance, and rewards those who built substance without seeking approval. You didn't ace it because you played harder. You aced it because you lived in a way that couldn't be faked. The final game revealed what people fear the most, that preparation is invisible. They thought success would show itself through noise, through declarations, through constant demonstrations of strength. You proved that preparation hides in consistency, in the choices no one celebrates, in the discipline that feels lonely until it suddenly becomes unshakable presence. They couldn't fake what you carried, because it wasn't an act. It was a reality etched into your very movements. Pressure made them crumble. Pressure made you shine. They wanted to believe luck played a role. They wanted to believe you stumbled into victory by accident. But you know better. It wasn't luck that made you ace the final game. It was every sleepless night you endured, every failure you digested, every rejection you turned into resilience. The final game was the sum of all the hidden trials, all the unseen battles, all the scars that no one clapped for. You had been tested long before anyone called it a game. They were tested only when the final whistle blew. That is why they fell apart. The irony is that they spent their lives trying to prepare for the wrong games. They prepared for arguments, for comparisons, for shallow competitions. You prepared for life. You didn't seek to defeat anyone. You sought to master yourself. The final game wasn't about others at all. It was about who could carry themselves to the end without breaking. They had invested in image. You had invested in character. And when the test came, image was washed away, character remained. You aced it because you understood what they didn't. That the end game is never about the applause of the crowd, but the weight of truth. You weren't searching for recognition. You were searching for resilience. And resilience always wins the game no one expects. They couldn't fake endurance. They couldn't fake patience. They couldn't fake conviction. Those are qualities pressure demands to see, and you had them in full. The scoreboard was written in silence, and silence placed your name on top. They designed the game to keep you stuck. They wanted you trapped in cycles of reaction, chasing validation and bleeding energy on their terms. Toxic people thrive on wounds because wounds make you predictable. They bet on your anger, your need to prove it, your desperation to be understood. They fed on the chaos of your brokenness, because as long as you stayed in pain, they had leverage. The game was never announced, never spoken, but it was there in every manipulation, every guilt trip, every silent punishment. You weren't supposed to win. You were supposed to keep circling the same trap, too exhausted to notice that they set it. Yet healing was the unexpected move that broke their entire design. You healed, and without even realizing it, you stole the only victory that ever mattered. They thought control was permanent. They thought if they repeated the cycle long enough, you would forget what life felt like outside of it. They wanted your identity to revolve around their chaos. They wanted you addicted to the pain they provided, because addiction keeps people from leaving. But you stepped away from the game without announcing it. You began choosing silence over reaction, peace over drama, presence over performance. They didn't notice at first. They thought you were still in the contest. But when they pressed the old buttons and you didn't move, when they threw the same traps and you didn't fall, that was the moment they realized the rules had changed. Healing wasn't just recovery, it was rebellion. In their minds, your healing was impossible because they saw themselves as permanent architects of your pain. They expected you to spend years justifying, years explaining, years begging them to acknowledge what they did. But healing doesn't wait for acknowledgement. Healing doesn't ask permission. Healing happens when you decide that what they did no longer defines what you become. And that shift terrifies them. Because the moment you start healing, the game is no longer theirs. They lose the advantage of being your wound. They can no longer claim control when you have turned their weapon into your strength. They used to thrive when you reacted. Every flare of anger, every breakdown, every attempt to prove your worth gave them proof that they mattered. You were their mirror, reflecting their power. But healing shattered that mirror. Now, when they reach for you, they touch nothing. They try to reopen the wound, but you no longer bleed. And that is the greatest insult to toxic people. That the very game they created collapses without your participation. You didn't beat them by fighting harder. You beat them by refusing to play. The psychology is cruel in its simplicity. Toxic people survive by planting their pain inside you and watching you carry it. It's their form of control. If you never let go, they never lose. But once you start healing, you drop the weight they secretly prayed you'd hold forever. That drop is louder than any confrontation. It exposes them. Because if you are no longer broken, then their legacy of control is meaningless. And without that legacy, they are forced to face themselves, something they've spent their entire lives avoiding. They will tell others you haven't healed. They will rewrite stories to make it seem like you still chase them, still suffer because of them. They will whisper that you are bitter, that you are weak, because they need people to believe their contest is still ongoing. But your actions, your calm, your presence expose their lies more brutally than any words could. People can see when someone has healed. They can feel the stability, the groundedness, the untouchable aura. And once that becomes clear, their narrative collapses with their game. Healing isn't just about peace, it's about power. When you heal, you don't just recover what was lost. You gain new sight, new strength, new clarity. You become someone who sees their manipulation for what it was. You become someone who doesn't flinch when they try to return. That frightens them more than anything, because it means the version of you they played against is gone forever. They will try to provoke the old you, but that version died in the process of healing. And the new you is someone they cannot touch. They spent years investing in your brokenness because it guaranteed their control. Healing bankrupted them. It erased the only leverage they had. The contest they designed depended on you staying reactive, dependent, fragile. They never planned for what would happen if you chose to repair yourself. They never prepared for what it would feel like to lose their power over you. Healing took away the oxygen their toxicity needed. You suffocated the game without even realizing you were doing it. You win when you stop proving. You win when you stop explaining. You win when their voice no longer dictates your worth. That is the quiet victory that cuts them the deepest. Because contests built by toxic people are designed to have no finish line. They keep you running forever. Healing is what builds the finish line where they swore one didn't exist. You crossed it, and now they stand behind, still running in circles, while you walk free. They thought gaslighting would break you. They thought twisting reality, denying what you saw, and questioning what you felt would leave you doubting yourself forever. They wanted you lost in confusion, relying on them to define what was true. But in their arrogance, they overlooked something. Gaslighting is training. It forces you to look closer, to listen harder, to sense what others miss. The very trick they used to blind you sharpened your vision instead. They built illusions, but you learned to see the cracks. They wore masks, but you learned to read the eyes. They denied your reality, and you built an inner compass so strong that no denial can ever shake it again. That's the irony. They tried to weaken you, but they forged your perception into a blade sharper than theirs. Every lie they told was a lesson. When they said they never said the words you just heard, you learned to pay attention not only to words but to tone, pauses, body language. When they told you that your memory was faulty, you began to record details in silence, small fragments no one else noticed. When they said you were overreacting, you realized the power of emotional awareness, that your gut was not broken, but guiding. They thought they were erasing your trust in yourself, but all they did was push you into building an internal system stronger than external noise. They taught you the art of seeing through masks, because you had no choice but to survive their games. Gaslighting breeds suspicion at first, and that suspicion feels like poison. You begin questioning everything. But over time, suspicion becomes insight. You stop taking words at face value and start watching actions with ruthless precision. You no longer fall for smiles meant to hide betrayal or apologies meant to reset the board. You know what consistency looks like, what real intent feels like. They don't realize they trained you to look beneath the surface. And once you can see beneath, no mask is safe. They thrived on control, but gaslighting gave you X-ray vision. You now see the small hesitations when someone lies. You catch the shift in tone when someone pretends to care. You notice the way eyes harden for half a second when envy slips out. Normal people might miss those things, but you catch them all. And once you learn to see, you cannot unsee. Their masks become flimsy, their acts become laughable. Their illusions cannot hold, because you've already been through the worst of deception and learned to see its fingerprints everywhere. They wanted you to feel powerless, They wanted you to need them for clarity. But clarity became something you no longer outsource. You built it in yourself, forged in the fire of doubt. You became someone who can hold two realities side by side, examine them, and discard the false one without hesitation. That's a skill they will never have, because manipulators don't look inward. They don't train themselves to discern truth. They train themselves to perform lies. You now see through lies faster than they can invent them, and that leaves them powerless in the game they once ruled. The irony cuts deeper when you realize how many masks crumble around you now. Not just theirs, but everyone's. You can't be fooled by charm without substance, promises without action, or confidence without competence. Gaslighting was meant to make you blind, but now you see through the world with eyes that detect what others ignore. People wonder how you always spot fakes, how you always know when someone's words don't match their intentions. The answer is simple. You were trained by masters of deception, and you graduated from their school without even signing up for it. They underestimated the human mind. They thought breaking it would leave you fragile, but the mind adapts. The mind grows tools in response to survival. They stripped away your trust in others, so your trust in yourself grew roots. They stripped away certainty, so your patience with truth grew longer. They stripped away ease, so your endurance became iron. The very techniques they used to weaken you became the exercises that built your strength. Their gaslighting was a curse, but it turned into your awakening. The masks people wear now look cheap to you. They no longer dazzle you the way they dazzle others. You see the performance, the desperation underneath. They can fool crowds, but not you. And that isolation, that ability to see what others cannot, carries both burden and power. Burden, because you cannot return to ignorance. Power because you are no longer trapped in illusions. They left you with a gift they never intended to give, a clarity that slices through deceit like glass. They will never admit it, but gaslighting failed. Not only did it fail, it backfired. It turned you into someone immune to manipulation, someone who no longer dances to the tune of liars. You now wear the kind of presence that unsettles manipulators, because they know you see through them before they even begin. They sense it, and it terrifies them. They can no longer play the game, because you've memorized every move, every mask, every denial. The irony is complete. They used deception as a weapon, but it became your armor. They wore masks to control you, but those masks taught you to see through all masks. They thought they left you broken, but they left you sharper. They thought you would question yourself forever, but now you question them, and they cannot endure it. Gaslighting was their weapon. Clarity became your revenge, and now every mask they put on feels transparent, because you learned the one lesson they never wanted you to. Truth has a way of piercing through, and once your eyes are open, no one can close them again. They built their world on shadows, on whispered doubts, on games where no one was meant to win. Every toxic circle thrives on darkness because darkness hides the truth. They want you second-guessing yourself, waiting for permission. Trapped in their maze of silence and manipulation, they feed on hesitation. They laugh when you dim yourself to fit the room. But the real victory was never in outsmarting them inside their shadows. The real victory was walking into the light, unapologetically, without asking if you were allowed. That moment is when the circle collapses, because shadows cannot follow you into clarity. They depended on your fear of standing alone. You won by leaving the circle behind, by showing that your power was not bound by their approval. They told you stories that the circle was protection. They told you that stepping out would mean failure, abandonment, loneliness. That is the lie every toxic circle weaves. They pretend the darkness is safety because it keeps you manageable. They pretend the shadows are home because it keeps you small. But when you stepped into the light, you learned that the chains were only illusions. You realized that everything they warned you about, the rejection, the collapse, was nothing compared to the freedom of breathing outside their grip. You were never safe in their shadow. You were only silenced. And now, with every step into the light, you prove that silence is not survival. It was the trap. They depended on your loyalty to the darkness. They expected you to keep playing the roles they assigned. Quiet, agreeable, compliant. They thought guilt would anchor you. They thought fear would bind you. But guilt fades when you understand it was planted to control you. Fear dissolves when you taste independence. They wanted you to believe the light was too harsh, that you would burn outside their circle. Yet stepping into the light revealed that they were the ones burning. Their shadows only worked when you stayed in them. The moment you left, their power shrank to nothing. In psychology, toxic circles are built on groupthink. They train you to value belonging over authenticity, agreement over truth, silence over honesty. They weaponize the human desire to fit in. But the cruel beauty of breaking free is that once you choose authenticity, the desire for belonging weakens. You learn that peace matters more than their acceptance. You stop needing their nods to validate your choices. And that is the ultimate betrayal to their system. You stop needing them at all. They thrive only when you feel powerless without them. When you realize you never needed them, their circle disintegrates. They told you light was arrogance. They told you stepping out was selfish. They told you speaking your truth was betrayal. But you discovered those words were simply tools to keep you obedient. Every step into the light exposes that their so-called morality was nothing more than control. And the irony is that the moment you claim your light, they paint you as the villain. They call you disloyal, cold, heartless. Yet even in their accusations, they reveal their fear, because they know once one person steps into the light, others might follow. Your rebellion becomes the proof that survival outside the shadow is possible. They rely on cycles. Every toxic circle survives on repetition. The same arguments, the same guilt, the same rituals of pulling you back in. They hope you'll forget you have a choice. They thrive on reaction, not reflection. But stepping into the light requires no reaction. It requires decision. You do not argue with the shadow. You outgrow it. You do not beg them to see the truth, you embody it. That's how you break the cycle, not by convincing them, not by proving your worth, by stepping out without waiting for them to agree. That is the betrayal they cannot forgive, and the liberation you will never regret. They saw you as dependent. They assumed you would never risk the unknown, never risk walking alone, never risk the criticism. They saw you as a permanent character in their play, scripted to follow their lines. But stepping into the light tore the script in half. You created your own story, one where their approval had no place. They cannot fathom someone leaving their stage and building a better one outside. But that is exactly what you did. You aced the game not by playing better in the shadows, but by refusing to play at all. The light is costly, yes. It strips you of the comfort of the familiar. It forces you to face yourself without excuses. It leaves you standing without the cushion of false belonging. But the cost of shadows is greater. They demand your identity, your voice, your strength. They give you safety at the price of freedom. You chose the harder cost, and in doing so, you claim the greater reward, because the light, once entered, never lets you go back to the same blindness. Once you see, you cannot unsee. Once you stand free, you cannot crawl back. They will resent you for leaving. They will whisper, scheme, paint you as the betrayer. But every word they throw is proof of their desperation. If you were truly irrelevant, they wouldn't speak at all. They attack because your light exposes their shadows, because your freedom makes their captivity obvious. They wonder how you did it, how you dared. And the truth burns them. It wasn't luck, it wasn't rescue. It was choice. You chose light. You chose truth. You chose yourself. And that is the one move they cannot control. They built their world on prediction. They studied your patterns, memorized your habits, and bet everything on the assumption that you would stay consistent with who they believed you to be. They wanted you predictable, easy to anticipate, easy to control. They thought their design accounted for every move you could make, every decision you might choose. But what they never saw coming was the moment you stepped outside the script, the moment you became the outlier. You shifted from a pawn to an anomaly, and in that shift, their system broke. Their equations stopped making sense. Their confidence turned to panic. You were no longer part of the design. They built the design around you, and you walked away from it without hesitation. They wanted control through familiarity. They relied on repetition. They assumed yesterday's you would be tomorrow's you. They couldn't imagine transformation. Not from you, not from someone they thought they had fully mapped out. And yet, change is exactly what you chose. You became someone unpredictable not because you were reckless, but because you were growing in directions they never accounted for. They had calculated the old you, the wounded you, the hesitant you. They had no formula for the healed you, the decisive you, the powerful you who no longer responded to their traps. That is why you became the anomaly, the one variable they never prepared for. They played games of manipulation, thinking they could lure you with old tricks. They dangled bait, expecting you to bite the way you always had. But your silence broke their rhythm. Your refusal to react dismantled their control. An outlier does not play by the rules of the data set. It bends the curve until the curve itself becomes meaningless. You bent their entire framework until it snapped. They could not calculate your patience, your ability to wait, your willingness to grow in solitude. In their eyes, you became dangerous not because of what you said, but because of what they could no longer predict. The psychology of control depends on patterns. People who seek power over others need consistency to manipulate it. They feed on the certainty of your reactions, on the predictability of your behavior. When you stepped outside of that, when you stopped being reactive, when you started thinking on your own terms, their design began to collapse. They underestimated how much strength comes from becoming an outlier. They thought anomalies are mistakes, but in truth, anomalies are revelations. They show the cracks in the design itself, and you became that revelation. They called you unpredictable, but unpredictability was not your goal. You weren't trying to confuse them. You were trying to free yourself. You evolved into someone who no longer needed their recognition, who no longer danced for their approval. That freedom made you impossible to place on their board. You didn't fit their labels anymore. You didn't fit their expectations. You became a new category they had no name for, and that unsettled them more than outright rebellion. Rebellion they could fight. Anomaly they could not fight, because anomalies reveal flaws in the entire system. They will pretend they still know you. They will say you are the same as before, that you cannot change, that you are still bound by who you were. But their words betray their fear.